Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking something that sounds a bit terrifying, but is honestly absolutely fascinating, a 9.5 out of 10 systemic risk index. Now, if you're hearing that and thinking, okay, that sounds like apocalyptic hyperbole, you know what? That is entirely fair. In our modern lives, we haven't actually witnessed a full-scale phase shift firsthand, so the whole idea can feel, well, incredibly abstract. But today, we're stripping away the abstract modeling. We're looking directly at history's breaking points to understand exactly what happens when the literal mechanisms of a society simply stop. So let's dive right in by contrasting what we're conditioned to expect with what a 9.5 shift actually is. Typically, we expect recessions to behave kind of like a swinging pendulum, right? The economy dips down, sure, but it inevitably swings back up to normal. But listen. A 9.5 scenario is not just a really deep, painful recession. It's the exact moment that pendulum snaps completely off its hinge. We're talking about a discontinuous structural rollover. That's a term from complexity science, describing the exact moment when the fundamental rules of the game just abruptly change. Here's how we're going to break this down today. First, we'll define the 9.5 phase shift. Then we'll look at three historical examples: France's resource shock, Rome's empty dole, and the USSR's Potemkin ledger, before we wrap things up with the modern sandpile. Section 1. The 9.5 phase shift, when a mechanisms stop. So the absolutely crucial point here is that a 9.5 scenario isn't just, a period of high unemployment or some nasty bear market. It's a structural rollover. It's the moment when the basic underlying mechanisms that literally keep a society functioning and coordinating, they just stop working. And to see what this actually looks like in the real world, we've got to examine specific historical eras where this exact phase shift occurred. Section 2. France, the resource shock, 1789 to 1792. Okay, let's look at the early stages of the French Revolution. The pressure on the crown initially came from what we can call the luxury protest phase. This was driven by your elite and upper-middle-class ideologues, writers, lawyers, reformist nobles. They were out there distributing pamphlets, debating abstract Enlightenment concepts about constitutional limits. But here's the thing. The Overton window didn't shatter because of those debates. It shattered because of a massive physical resource shock. A catastrophic harvest failure basically collided head-on with a huge fiscal deficit, where the state was spending over 50% of its revenue literally just to service its existing debt. And this number right here brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of that shock. Suddenly, the cost of a single loaf of bread jumped to an astounding 80% of a working-class Frenchman's daily wage. I mean, just think about that for a second. When 80% of your income is required just to secure enough calories to survive one day, everything else just ceases to matter. Because of that massive price shock, those sophisticated political ideologues, they were instantly overridden. The urban zero-margin destitute class, the sans-culottes, were activated. And frankly, they didn't care about constitutional syntax. Caloric survival completely overrode all political discourse. And because this working class was so deeply embedded inside the city's logistics, when the state tried to use military force to clear the streets, well, it backfired catastrophically. The people seized the arms depots, they stopped coordinating with royal administrators, and the entire infrastructure of the French state simply dissolved into a violent scramble for resources. Section 3. Rome, the empty dole and hyper-local survival. Now, for centuries, Roman resilience really relied on structural slack, deploying legions or pulling grain from Egypt to absorb shocks. But by the mid-200s AD, that slack was totally exhausted. The leadership developed what's known as anosognosia. It's essentially a total cognitive blindness to physical realities. Faced with all these mountain costs from border wars, Roman emperors did exactly what modern central banks do. They debased the silver content of their currency to print money they simply didn't have. And doing that triggered a deadly chain reaction called the coercion feedback loop. Let's walk through it. With the structural slack exhausted in step 1, leadership moved to step 2, debasing the currency. Now, of course, that triggered hyperinflation, meaning the working class could no longer afford basic goods, which naturally led to step 3, protests. But the emperors viewed these protests as a direct challenge to their absolute dominance, leading right into step 4, launching brutal military crackdowns. And it was that crackdown that became the fatal trigger.
See, because the state had totally exhausted its wealth, it couldn't afford the actual physical bread giveaways anymore, the famous grain dole. So, with the benefits of empire basically gone and the military now turning on the populace, the people simply stopped cooperating. Trucking and shipping routes became way too dangerous due to banditry, and instead of remaining this unified empire, Roman society completely fractured. Landowners fortified their own private estates, municipalities stopped sending taxes back to the capital, and the imperial footprint was just violently scrubbed out. The population actively chose hyper-local survival over imperial compliance.
Section 4. USSR, the Potemkin Ledger, 1989 to 1991.
The contrast here is incredibly stark. Throughout the 1980s, Soviet leadership lived inside this abstract world of pure spreadsheets and production targets. The official state ledger recorded steady industrial output. It was basically a massive state-enforced Potemkin ledger. But the physical boundary of the country? Completely out of runway. Decades of misallocating resources, combined with an energy shock from collapsing oil prices and that bleeding-edge war in Afghanistan, well, it consumed all the nation's remaining slack. For ordinary citizens, the transmission lag dropped to zero. Their daily reality was waiting in these huge, long lines just for basic goods like soap, bread, and sugar, while the elite completely ignored the structural rot.
The ultimate breaking point finally came in 1991. The central government attempted a hardline coup and a military crackdown to forcefully restore order. But just like we saw in Rome, using force when the physical resources are literally gone, it just accelerates the collapse. Positive feedback loops took over immediately. Local republics and municipal distribution hubs simply issued declarations of non-cooperation. They completely ignored Moscow's directives and just kept their own resources. A superpower armed with thousands of nuclear weapons collapsed in a matter of weeks, and they did it all without a single conventional invasion.
Section 5. The modern sandpile, resilience or volatility. So across all three of these vastly different eras, a 9.5 collapse always, and I mean always, manifests with these specific identical symptoms. It happens when the brutal physics of an 8-8 regime take over. First, the official currency is rejected by the public. Then, the logistics networks completely freeze up because operators strike for basic food and fuel. Central government directives, they're treated as literal background noise. And local authorities start focusing purely on immediate, hyper-local survival. This is it. This is the precise moment when the abstract matrix of the economy collides violently with the unbreakable physical laws of supply and demand. Given everything we've uncovered in this explainer about the fragility of complex systems when their structural slack is exhausted, I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. Take a look at our highly interconnected modern world. Do you think our modern digitized society possesses invisible technical workarounds that can infinitely delay this kind of phase shift? Or does our extreme just-in-time supply chain dependency actually make our modern sandpile much, much more volatile and prone to a sudden collapse than the empires of the past? It's a question we all absolutely need to be asking.